Okay, Taimur, good to have you with us. So we have India's GDP number for the first quarter coming in below market expectations and also below your forecast as well. What's going on in India these days?
Well, part of the reason for the downward surprise was huge amount of revision to the data. So if the data had not been revised, we probably would have seen about an 8.5% growth quarter for January-March. But even putting that aside, I think the most interesting aspect of this cycle is that unlike the previous years when investment-led growth, here investment is lagging. So if you look at the Jan-March data on a year-on-year basis, investment is basically flat. So all other parts of the economy are more or less chugging along. Indian consumers are making pretty decent income. They're consuming quite a bit. Agriculture production is on track. Service sector is doing pretty well, but investment is extremely anemic, and that's what's explaining some of the sluggishness from the growth trajectory right now.
Yeah, and what about, of course, inflation? You know, that seems to be the big hurdle for the RBI right now. How do you think they'll get inflation under control? Are we talking about more interest rate hikes for this year?
Well, more interest rate hike is certainly part of the requirement, but it's beyond that. I mean, it's not just a question of the central bank raising interest rates and trying to cool demand down. India has massive supply-side structural bottlenecks. It also has massive gaps in its policy framework from the way inflation is targeted or not vis-a-vis the way the government carries out its subsidy policy. So my fear is that it's not just a cyclical issue that, you know, we have high inflation and with some interest rate hike we'll get low inflation down the road. It's more like over a 10-year trend basis, India is experiencing higher and higher inflation, and we just might have to live with high inflation regardless of the cycle.
Wow, okay, so it might be a structural issue, Taimur. Let me just ask you, though, are you expecting another interest rate hike, say, at the next June policy meeting, and how many more for this year?
Right. So my call right now is the RBI continues hiking, so 25 basis points in June, similar again in July, and then they meet again in September, another 25 basis points, taking the repo rate all the way up to 8%.
Okay, so let me just ask you then, for economic growth for this year in India, are we going to see it hover, say, around 7%, or could it come in even below that mark, do you think?
No, actually, I'm kind of sanguine about the growth outlook. I know that, you know, the inflation headwind is creating a lot of headlines, and people wonder whether India's growth will slow down substantially. The fact of the matter is there is very substantial wage growth in the Indian economy, and the retail sector, consumption, is doing pretty well. So as long as trade does well, I think that between trade and consumption, we will be able to counteract whatever slowdown that is coming from the investment side. So I'm maintaining a growth forecast of 8% or even a little higher than that.